The December air carried that particular bite that makes you pull your jacket tighter without thinking about it. I stood in my garage, running my thumb over the smooth handle of a socket wrench that had served me faithfully for 30 years. The concrete floor was swept clean, my tools hung in perfect rows along the pegboard Caroline had painted white the summer before she passed. Everything in its place, the way she'd taught me to keep things. The workbench held the remnants of my latest project, a wooden jewelry box I'd been crafting with no particular recipient in mind, just something to keep my hands busy during the long evenings when the house felt too quiet. The maple had a beautiful grain, the kind Caroline would have run her fingers over while making appreciative sounds. She had always had an eye for wood grain, for the hidden patterns that revealed themselves only under careful attention. Above the bench, our wedding photo sat in a frame I'd built from leftover oak. Caroline's smile was radiant in that way that had caught me off guard every morning for 43 years. Her dress was simple but elegant, my suit borrowed from my father. We looked impossibly young, impossibly hopeful. The photo had lived on Caroline's dresser for decades, but after she passed, I'd moved it here to the garage where I could see it while I worked. "Still can't believe you're gone," I said to the photograph, the words coming easier in the solitude of my workshop than they did in the empty house. The familiar ritual of cleaning up began. Each tool returned to its proper place, sawdust swept into neat piles, the coffee can where I kept loose screws and washers checked and organized. Caroline used to tease me about my workshop habits. "Richard, you clean that garage like it's going to be inspected by the general," she'd say, laughing. But order had always been my way of making sense of chaos. When everything else felt uncertain, certain. At least my tools knew where they belonged. I switched off the overhead lights and headed toward the house, my breath visible in small puffs. The back door led directly into the kitchen, where the lingering scent of the roast chicken I'd made for dinner still hung in the air. The table was set for one, a habit I'd finally accepted rather than fought. For months after Caroline's funeral, I'd automatically reached for 2 plates before remembering. Now, the single-place setting felt natural, if not exactly comfortable. The kitchen still bore Caroline's touches everywhere. The blue ceramic canisters she'd found at a church bazaar, lined up beside the coffee maker. The small herb garden she'd insisted on keeping by the window, now tended by me with the careful devotion of a man honoring a promise. The refrigerator was covered with photographs held by magnets she'd collected from every place we'd ever visited. Niagara Falls, Yellowstone, the coast of Maine where we'd spent our 25th anniversary. Most prominent among the photos was one from last Christmas. Ethan, my 38-year-old son, stood beside the tree in our living room, his arm around Madison, his wife of 6 years. They were both smiling, but looking back now, I could see something strained around their eyes. Or maybe I was reading the present into the past, looking for signs I'd missed at the time. The phone rang just as I was settling into my chair with a cup of coffee. The caller ID showed Ethan's name, and for a moment my heart lifted. It had been 3 weeks since we'd last spoken. A brief, awkward conversation about changing the oil in his car that had felt more like a transaction between strangers than a talk between father and son. "Ethan," I answered, unable to keep the warmth entirely out of my voice. "Dad?" His tone was businesslike, stripped of any seasonal cheer. "I wanted to talk to you about Christmas." I settled deeper into my chair. "Of course. What time should I come over? I can bring that glazed ham you always liked, or maybe—" "Actually, Dad, that's what I wanted to discuss." The interruption came fast, practiced, as if he'd rehearsed this conversation. "We're keeping things small this year, just Madison's family." The words didn't register immediately. I heard them, processed them individually, but their meaning felt like a puzzle with missing pieces. Small? Madison's parents are flying in from Denver. Her sister and brother-in-law will be there with the kids. It's going to be pretty crowded already. I set my coffee mug down slowly, the ceramic making a soft click against the wooden side table. Crowded. You understand, right? Space is limited, and with everyone coming... He trailed off, leaving the sentence unfinished, as if the logic were so obvious it didn't require completion. I understood all right. I understood that my son was disinviting me from Christmas dinner, from the holiday that Caroline and I had hosted in this very house for 15 years, from the tradition we'd built when Ethan was young, the early morning present opening, the elaborate breakfast Caroline would spend hours preparing, the way the house would fill with laughter and the warm scent of cinnamon rolls. I see, I said quietly. I knew you'd get it. You're always so reasonable about these things. Reasonable. The word sat in my mouth like something bitter. When had being accommodating become my defining characteristic? When had my son started expecting me to simply accept whatever arrangements he made without consulting me? What about Christmas Eve? I asked, hating the note of hope I could hear in my own voice. Maybe we could. Madison's hosting a cocktail party Christmas Eve. Work people, mostly. You'd be bored. The second rejection landed harder than the first. Not only was I unwelcome for Christmas dinner, but Christmas Eve, traditionally a quiet family evening in our household, had been claimed by Madison's social calendar. Right, I managed. But hey, Ethan said, his tone brightening with the forced cheer of someone trying to sand the rough edges off bad news. Maybe we can get together the weekend after, when things calm down. When things calm down. As if Christmas were a natural disaster that simply had to be endured rather than a holiday we'd once celebrated together. As if the calming down period would make his rejection sting less. Sure, I said, though we both knew the weekend after would bring its own excuses. That sounds fine. Great. Madison will be relieved. She was worried you might take this the wrong way. Madison was worried. Not Ethan himself, but his wife. The woman who had smiled politely at family gatherings for 6 years while slowly erasing me from my son's life, one holiday at a time. Well, I said, surprised by how steady my voice sounded, tell Madison not to worry. I will. And Dad, thanks for understanding. It means a lot. The line went dead before I could respond. I sat holding the phone, listening to the dial tone, feeling something fundamental shift inside my chest. Not anger, that would come later. Not even hurt, exactly. More like recognition. The recognition that the relationship I'd thought I still had with my son had been a polite fiction, maintained on my side through hope and on his side through convenience. I hung up and walked to the kitchen window. Outside, Christmas lights twinkled on the neighbors' houses. The Hendersons next door had their tree visible through their front window, surrounded by wrapped presents and family members I could see moving about in the warm yellow glow. Normal families doing normal things on a December evening. The contrast with my own kitchen, silent except for the hum of the refrigerator, was stark. I opened the refrigerator and pulled out the ingredients I'd already bought for Christmas dinner. A small turkey, too small for the feast Caroline and I used to prepare, but right-sized for sharing with Ethan and Madison. Sweet potatoes, cranberries, the bottle of white wine Madison preferred. All of it purchased with the assumption that I'd be spending Christmas the way I had for the past 43 years, surrounded by family. I left everything on the counter and walked to the living room. The Christmas tree I'd put up the week before stood in its usual corner, decorated with ornaments that told the story of our family. The angel Caroline had bought our first year of marriage. The handmade clay ornament Ethan had crafted in 2nd grade. Lopsided but treasured. The collection of glass balls we'd accumulated over 4 decades, each one a memory of a Christmas past. For 3 years since Caroline's death, I'd continued decorating the tree out of habit, or hope, or simple stubbornness. This year, looking at it in the lamplight, it felt less like celebration than memorial. I sat in my reading chair. Caroline's chair remained empty beside mine, still positioned at the same angle where she used to curl up with her knitting, and tried to process what had just happened. The conversation had been so casual, so matter-of-fact. Ethan's tone had suggested he was doing me a favor by explaining the arrangements rather than simply not calling at all. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized this hadn't been a spur-of-the-moment decision. The careful phrasing, the prepared responses to my questions, the way he'd anticipated my objections, all of it suggested planning, discussion between him and Madison, maybe consultation with her parents about how best to handle the Richard problem. My coffee had gone cold. I got up to reheat it and found myself standing at the kitchen sink, staring out at the backyard, where Caroline's garden lay dormant under a light coating of snow. She'd spent countless hours out there, hands deep in soil, planning which flowers would bloom when, creating a succession of colors that would carry us from spring through fall. Persistence, she'd said when I'd asked her secret. Flowers don't hurry, but they don't quit either. The memory hit me harder than I'd expected. Caroline had possessed a quiet strength that I'd always admired, but never fully understood. She didn't fight with words or grand gestures. She simply continued being who she was, planting her garden, hosting her book club, treating everyone with the same gentle firmness that somehow made them want to be better than they were. What would she say if she could see this Christmas? If she could witness her son excluding his father from the family table? I knew the answer. Caroline would have been heartbroken, but she wouldn't have been surprised. She'd seen the changes in Ethan long before I'd been willing to acknowledge them. The way he had started measuring his visits by obligation rather than desire, the increasingly long gaps between phone calls, the gradual shift from asking about my life to simply updating me on his. He's finding his own path, she'd said during her final months, but I hope it leads him back to who raised him. I'd assumed it would. I'd assumed that grief would bring us closer, that losing Caroline would remind us both of how precious family connections were. Instead, it had given Ethan permission to distance himself further. Without Caroline to bridge the gap between us with her gentle translations of my practical silences and his restless ambitions, we had defaulted to the awkward politeness of distant relatives. The phone rang again. For a moment, hope flared. Maybe Ethan had reconsidered. Maybe this was the call where he'd say he had made a mistake, that of course I was welcome for Christmas. But it was Mrs. Patterson from across the street, asking if I'd be willing to help move her Christmas tree into position. Her husband had thrown out his back, and she was hoping I might lend a hand. Of course, I said, grateful for something useful to do. I spent the next hour in the Pattersons' living room, wrestling with a Douglas fir that seemed determined to tip over despite our best efforts. Their house smelled like pine needles and cinnamon candles, and their grandchildren's artwork decorated every available surface. When we finally got the tree stable, Mrs. Patterson insisted on making hot chocolate. "It's so nice to have neighbors we can count on," she said, pressing the warm mug into my hands. "Especially this time of year. Family can be such a blessing." I nodded, not trusting my voice. Through their front window, I could see my own house, lights on in the kitchen, the tree visible through my living room window. From the outside, it looked welcoming, lived in. No one would guess that the man who lived there had just been told he wasn't wanted for Christmas. Back home, I stood in my living room and really looked at the tree for the first time since I decorated it. Each ornament told a story of Christmases when we'd been a family. The wooden star Ethan had made in high school shop class, the delicate glass angel Caroline had splurged on during our lean early years, because Christmas deserves something beautiful. The collection of photo ornaments marking milestones, first house, promotions, anniversaries. I reached for one ornament in particular, a small silver frame containing a photo of Ethan at age 5, gap-toothed and grinning as he held up a toy truck I'd assembled for him Christmas morning. I'd stayed up until 3 that morning, wrestling with instructions written in 3 languages, determined to have it perfect when he woke up. The boy in the photograph looked nothing like the man who'd just excluded me from his Christmas table. I set the ornament carefully back on its branch and walked to Caroline's desk, where she had kept our important papers in neat labeled files. Everything was still organized exactly as she'd left it: insurance policies, medical records, the deed to the house, and a folder marked family that contained birth certificates, report cards, and every letter Ethan had written home from college. I pulled out one letter, dated December 95. Ethan had been homesick during his freshman year, missing Caroline's Christmas cookies and complaining about the dorm food. "Can't wait to come home," he'd written in his careful college handwriting. "I dream about Mom's roast turkey and sitting by our tree, talking until midnight like we did when I was little." The contrast between that eager boy and the man who just told me I wasn't welcome for Christmas was stark enough to take my breath away. I refolded the letter and placed it back in the folder. Then I sat in Caroline's chair and let myself feel the full weight of what had happened. This wasn't about space limitations or Madison's family visiting. This was about me becoming inconvenient, a complication in their carefully curated holiday celebration. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 10 times. Somewhere in Montclair, Ethan and Madison were probably discussing the menu for their Christmas dinner, debating seating arrangements, planning the kind of perfect holiday that didn't include an aging father who might bring down the mood with his grief or his memories of better times. But as I sat there in the lamplight, surrounded by 43 years of Christmas memories, I felt something begin to crystallize in my chest. Not bitterness, that would be too simple. Something colder and more useful. For 3 years, I'd been the accommodating father. I'd accepted their increasingly rare visits, their shortened phone calls, their gradual transformation from my family into my occasional obligation. I'd told myself that patience was love, that giving them space was generosity, but tonight, looking at the tree we decorated together when Ethan was young, remembering Caroline's voice reading "'Twas the Night Before Christmas" in the rocking chair that still sat by the fireplace, I understood something that should have been obvious long ago. They'd been pulling away by degrees, and I'd been enabling it by pretending not to notice. The phone sat silent on the side table. Part of me wanted to call Ethan back, to ask if we could compromise, if there might be room for me after all. But a larger part, the part that had built a successful construction business from nothing, that had learned to read blueprints and calculate load-bearing requirements and solve problems other people couldn't see solutions to, that part was already thinking differently. This wasn't a problem to be solved through accommodation or pleading. This was a situation that required strategy. I walked to the kitchen and pulled a yellow legal pad from the drawer where Caroline had kept grocery lists and recipe notes. At the top of the first page, I wrote, "Christmas, December 25th. Below that, not invited." The words looked strange written out, stark and undeniable. For 40 years, Christmas had been the cornerstone of our family life. The holiday Caroline had prepared for weeks in advance, filling the house with the scents of baking and the sounds of preparation. The day when Ethan would arrive early, still in his pajamas even as an adult, eager to see what Santa had brought. Now it was the day I'd spend alone, excluded not by circumstances or distance, but by choice, my son's choice. I set the pad aside and made myself a sandwich I didn't want, more for something to do with my hands than from any real hunger. As I ate, I found myself thinking about Caroline's last Christmas. She'd been weakened by chemo, but determined to maintain our traditions. She'd insisted on making her famous stuffing, had wrapped presents with hands that shook from medication, had smiled through the exhaustion because Christmas mattered to her. Ethan had been attentive that day, I remembered. He'd helped her to the table, had complimented her cooking, had stayed later than usual. At the time, I'd thought it was love. Now, I wondered if it had been guilt. Or maybe a kind of goodbye, not to Christmas, but to the version of himself who still cared about being part of our family. The grandfather clock chimed 11. I washed my single plate and glass, wiped down the counter, and turned off the kitchen light. In the living room, the Christmas tree glowed softly, its lights reflecting off the windows that looked out onto our quiet street. I stood there for a long moment, taking in the sight. Tomorrow, I'd begin taking it down. Not because I was angry, though there was anger, burning low and steady in my chest, but because a tree decorated for a celebration that wasn't going to happen felt more like mockery than memorial. But tonight, I let it stand. Tonight, I let myself remember what Christmas had meant when Caroline was alive, when Ethan still thought of this house as home, when family felt like something permanent rather than conditional. As I climbed the stairs to the bedroom I'd shared with Caroline for 38 years, I carried with me the image of that legal pad sitting on the kitchen table. 2 simple lines that somehow contained the seed of everything that would follow. Christmas morning would find me alone, but it wouldn't find me unprepared, because sometimes, when people show you who they really are, the kindest thing you can do is believe them and plan accordingly. Christmas Eve morning arrived gray and bitter, the kind of cold that seeps through the window frames and settles in your bones. I woke before dawn, a habit left over from 40 years of construction work, when the early bird caught the best lumber and the clearest thinking. The house was silent, except for the familiar sounds that had become my companions. The whisper of the heating system, the subtle creak of settling timber, the distant hum of the refrigerator cycling on. I made coffee in the pre-dawn darkness, measuring the grounds with the same precision I'd once used for concrete mixtures. The kitchen window showed only black glass reflecting the overhead light, but I knew what lay beyond it. The bird feeder Caroline had insisted on hanging from the oak tree, now empty because I'd forgotten to fill it yesterday. The garden beds she'd prepared so carefully for spring plantings that would never come. The newspaper arrived with a soft thud against the front door. I retrieved it without turning on the porch light, muscle memory guiding me through the familiar motions. Back in the kitchen, I spread it on the table and tried to focus on the headlines, but the words seemed to slide off the page. My mind kept circling back to the phone call, to the casual way Ethan had dismissed me from Christmas. "Space is limited," he'd said, as if I were a piece of furniture that might not fit in their newly configured family gathering. I folded the paper and pushed it aside. Through the kitchen doorway, I could see the Christmas tree in the living room, its lights on a timer that Caroline had set years ago. She'd loved the way they looked in the early morning hours, casting gentle colors across the walls before the sun came up. "It makes the house feel alive," she'd said, "even when we're asleep." Now those lights illuminated an empty room, casting their warm glow on photographs of a family that no longer existed. At least, not in the way I'd understood family. By 7, I was dressed and driving toward town. Not because I had anywhere particular to go, but because the house felt too small for the thoughts rattling around inside my head. Main Street was already busy with last-minute shoppers, people hurrying in and out of stores with bags and boxes, their faces bright with the particular urgency of Christmas Eve. I parked outside Henderson's Hardware, the store where I'd bought supplies for countless home projects over the years. Tom Henderson was behind the counter, as he had been for 30 years, his apron stained with the honest dirt of useful work. "Richard," he said, looking up from an invoice. "Finishing up some Christmas projects?" "Something like that," I said, though I had no projects to finish. I wandered the aisles, running my hands over familiar tools, breathing in the scent of metal and wood stain that had always felt like home to me. Near the back of the store, I overheard a conversation between two men comparing their holiday plans. One was complaining about his mother-in-law's cooking, but his tone was fond, exasperated in the way you can only be with family you're stuck with and grateful for in equal measure. The other was describing his tradition of Christmas morning fishing with his teenage son, something they'd done every year since the boy was old enough to hold a rod. Family traditions, the things that bind generations together, that create continuity across decades of change. I'd thought Ethan and I had those. Christmas morning gift exchange, the elaborate breakfast Caroline would orchestrate, the way we'd all three pile onto the couch afterward to watch old movies and digest turkey sandwiches. When had those traditions stopped mattering to him? When had they become obligations rather than joys? I bought a bag of birdseed I didn't need and drove to the cemetery where Caroline rested. The roads were clearer than I'd expected. Most people were home by now, preparing for their Christmas Eve celebrations. The cemetery was empty except for a few other visitors placing wreaths on headstones. People who understood that holidays could amplify loss as easily as joy. Caroline's marker was simple granite with her name, her dates, and the inscription we'd chosen together during her final weeks. Beloved wife and mother, who made every house a home. I cleared away the dead leaves that had gathered around the base and arranged the fresh poinsettia I'd brought. "He doesn't want me for Christmas," I said quietly, the words feeling strange in the cold air. "Our boy has decided I'm not part of the family anymore." A red cardinal landed on the oak tree above her grave, its bright feathers a splash of color against the gray sky. Caroline had always loved cardinals, had insisted they were messages from somewhere beyond our understanding. I watched it for a long moment before it flew away, disappearing into the bare branches like hope taking wing. The drive home took me past Ethan's neighborhood, not intentionally, but because it was the most direct route. I found myself slowing as I approached his street, then making the turn before I could talk myself out of it. His house sat on a corner lot, a colonial revival with perfect landscaping and a driveway that could accommodate 4 cars. 3 were there now: Ethan's BMW, Madison's Lexus, and a rental car with Colorado plates that must belong to her parents. Through the front window, I could see figures moving around what was obviously a Christmas Eve gathering in progress. The warm yellow light spilled onto the snow-covered lawn, and I caught a glimpse of Madison laughing at something someone had said. I sat in my truck at the curb, engine idling, feeling like a voyeur spying on a life that had once included me. The house was beautiful, expensive, the kind of place that appeared in magazine spreads about successful suburban living. But it felt as foreign to me as a house on another continent. A shadow moved past the window. Ethan, carrying what looked like a tray of drinks. He was laughing too, his face animated in a way I rarely saw anymore when he was with me. This was him, relaxed, happy, surrounded by people who understood the language he spoke now. People who appreciated the lifestyle he'd built, who didn't carry the weight of memories that predated his transformation from the boy I'd raised into the man he'd become. I put the truck in drive and pulled away before anyone could notice me. The last thing I wanted was to be seen lurking outside their Christmas celebration, like some pathetic figure begging for inclusion. Back home, I sat in my reading chair and tried to make sense of the financial timeline in my head. When Ethan had first married Madison, they'd lived modestly in a small apartment across town. I'd helped with the security deposit, a loan I'd never mentioned again because I assumed it was what fathers did. Then came the requests for help with the wedding. Not large amounts, but steady ones. Flowers, photography, catering upgrades. Each time I'd written the check because Caroline had insisted that weddings were investments in happiness. After the honeymoon, there had been more requests. Help with furniture for their first house. A loan for Madison's car when hers broke down. Assistance with the down payment on their current home. Each time, Ethan had been gracious but not particularly grateful, treating my help as a natural resource rather than a sacrifice. I'd kept careful records, not from suspicion, but from habit. Construction had taught me to document everything, to know where every dollar went. Now, sitting in the lamplight, I added up the figures in my head. Over the 6 years of their marriage, I'd provided nearly $60,000 in various forms of assistance. Money that had helped them build their perfect suburban life, their perfect suburban Christmas, their perfect suburban guest list that no longer included me. The irony wasn't lost on me. I'd funded my own exclusion. But the money itself wasn't what stung. I'd given it freely, happy to help my son and his wife establish themselves. What hurt was the assumption that my generosity entitled them to manage my inclusion in their lives like a thermostat, turning me up when they needed something, turning me down when they didn't. I thought about the times I'd called to check on them, only to reach voicemail. The invitations to visit that came with convenient restrictions. We're pretty busy right now, or maybe next month would be better. The gradual shift from spontaneous visits to scheduled appointments, as if my presence in their lives required advance notice and time limits. When had I become a burden to my own son? The question followed me as I moved through my evening routine, checking the locks, turning off lights, setting the coffee maker for morning. In the bedroom, I paused before the dresser where Caroline's jewelry box still sat exactly where she'd left it. I opened it and touched the pearl necklace I'd given her for our 10th anniversary, the earrings she'd worn to Ethan's wedding, the simple gold band that had never left her finger until the funeral director had gently removed it. She would have fought for Christmas, I realized, not with anger or demands, but with the quiet persistence that had been her signature strength. She would have found a way to just remind Ethan of what family meant, what traditions were supposed to preserve. She would have made him remember the boy who'd counted down the days until Christmas starting in November, who'd believed in magic because his parents had worked so hard to create it for him. But Caroline was gone, and the bridge she'd built between Ethan and me had collapsed without her there to maintain it. I lay in the darkness, listening to the wind move through the bare trees outside our bedroom window. Caroline's side of the bed remained untouched, the pillows still arranged as she'd left them. For 3 years, I'd found comfort in that unchanged space, as if maintaining it exactly as it was could somehow preserve her presence in the house. Tonight, it felt different. Tonight, it felt like I was preserving a museum to a life that had ended not with Caroline's death, but with that phone call from Ethan. The life where I was a father, a grandfather in waiting, a central figure in someone else's story, rather than a supporting character in my own diminished narrative. Sleep came in fragments, interrupted by memories that played like old movies. Christmas mornings when Ethan was small, tearing through wrapping paper with the focused intensity of a demolition expert. The year he'd convinced us to let him sleep under the tree Christmas Eve, certain that Santa would appreciate the company. The Christmas when he was 16 and pretended to be too cool for family traditions, but still managed to be downstairs before anyone else Christmas morning. Each memory was sharp enough to cut, beautiful enough to treasure, and distant enough to feel like they belonged to someone else's life. I woke before dawn and lay still, listening to the house breathe around me. Caroline used to say that houses had personalities, that ours was patient and welcoming, content to shelter whatever family lived within its walls. This morning, it felt expectant, as if waiting for something to begin rather than something to end. By the time the sun came up, I knew what I was going to do with Christmas Day. I was going to treat it like any other day, not in denial of what it meant, but in recognition of what it had become. A day when other people celebrated family, while I celebrated the quiet dignity of a man who'd learned to be comfortable in his own company. The bird feeder got filled first. Then I made pancakes from the mix Caroline had always used, eating them slowly while reading the parts of the newspaper I'd skipped the day before. The house felt neither empty nor full, just present, like it was waiting alongside me to see what came next. By noon, I'd made a decision that surprised even me. I was going to drive to the lake. Caroline and I had bought a small cabin on Clearwater Lake 15 years ago, intending it as a weekend retreat for our retirement years. After her diagnosis, we'd barely used it. Hospital schedules and treatment regimens had consumed our time. Since her death, I'd visited perhaps half a dozen times, always with the intention of selling it, but never quite able to follow through. Today felt like the right day to see it again, to sit by the water where Caroline had planned for us to grow old together and decide what came next. The drive took 40 minutes through countryside that was stark and beautiful in its winter barrenness. The lake was partially frozen, ice forming lacy patterns along the shore, while the center remained dark and open. Our cabin sat on a small rise overlooking the water, weathered cedar siding, and a stone chimney that Caroline had insisted was essential for proper winter ambiance. I let myself in with the key I'd carried but rarely used. The air inside was cold and stale, but everything was exactly as we'd left it. Caroline's books still lined the shelves beside the fireplace. Her reading glasses sat on the table where she'd placed them during our last visit. The quilt she'd been working on remained folded in the basket beside her chair, needles still threaded, waiting for hands that would never return to finish the pattern. I built a fire and sat in the chair that had been mine, looking out at the lake through windows that needed cleaning. This was what Caroline had envisioned for our retirement: peaceful mornings with coffee and newspapers, quiet evenings with books and conversation, the slow rhythm of days measured not by productivity but by contentment. We'd never gotten the chance to live that dream. Cancer had stolen those years from us, had reduced our time to hospital visits and treatment schedules, and the gradually diminishing hope that we might somehow cheat death long enough to enjoy what we'd worked so hard to build. But sitting there in the growing warmth of the fire, I realized something that felt like revelation. This place didn't have to be a monument to lost dreams. It could be something else entirely. By late afternoon, I'd made another decision. I wasn't going to sell the cabin. I was going to live in it. Not immediately, not as an escape from the hurt of Ethan's rejection, but as a choice towards something better. The house in town was full of memories of the family I'd lost. First Caroline, now Ethan, in a different but equally final way. This place could hold memories of the man I was becoming, the man who didn't need anyone else's permission to create a life worth living. I drove home as the sun set behind the bare trees, the truck's heater finally warming the cab enough to chase away the lake's chill. The house looked smaller when I pulled into the driveway, less substantial somehow, as if my afternoon at the cabin had shifted my perspective on what constituted home. Inside, the Christmas tree still glowed in the living room window. I stood looking at it for a long moment, seeing it not as a symbol of celebration, but as a marker of transition. Tomorrow, Christmas Day, I'd begin the process of taking it down, not in sadness, but in recognition that some chapters end so others can begin. The phone rang just as I was settling into my evening routine. For a wild moment, I thought it might be Ethan calling to apologize, to say he'd made a mistake, to invite me over for Christmas dinner after all, but it was Mrs. Patterson from across the street. "Richard, I hope I'm not calling too late. I just wanted to thank you again for helping with our tree yesterday." "It was no trouble, Eleanor. I also wanted to ask, Bob and I are having a few neighbors over tomorrow for Christmas brunch. Nothing fancy, just coffee and some of those Danish pastries from the bakery. You'd be more than welcome if you're not busy." The invitation was kindly meant, and for a moment I was tempted. It would be easier to surround myself with the warmth of other people's traditions than to face the silence of my own house on Christmas Day. "That's very thoughtful," I said, "but I've got some things I need to take care of tomorrow." "Of course, but if you change your mind, we'll be eating around 11. After she hung up, I realized I hadn't lied. I did have things to take care of, important things that had been waiting for me to be ready to address them. Tomorrow, Christmas Day, would mark the beginning of a new phase of my life, the phase where I stopped waiting for other people to include me and started building something that belonged entirely to me. I spent the evening organizing papers at Caroline's desk. Insurance documents, property deeds, bank statements, the paper trail of a life lived responsibly. In one file, I found the deed to the lake cabin, still titled in both our names. I made a note to call our lawyer after the holiday and have Caroline's name removed, not to erase her memory, but to acknowledge reality. As I worked, I found myself thinking about the patterns I'd fallen into since Caroline's death. The careful routine of meals for one, the evening phone calls to friends that had grown shorter, and less frequent. The gradual acceptance of isolation as a natural consequence of aging and loss. I'd been living like a man waiting for his life to end, rather than a man deciding how to spend the years he had left. Ethan's exclusion from Christmas had been cruel, but it had also been clarifying. It had stripped away the polite fiction that we were still a close family, that his increasingly rare visits and perfunctory phone calls meant something more than obligation. His rejection had been honest in a way our relationship hadn't been for years. And honesty, even when it hurt, was something I could work with. The grandfather clock chimed 10 times as I finished sorting through the papers. In the living room, the Christmas tree continued its patient vigil, lights twinkling in colors that had once meant joy and now felt more like witness. Tomorrow, I'd take it down ornament by ornament, wrapping each one in tissue paper and storing them away. Not forever, but for now, until I could decide what Christmas would mean in this new version of my life. I climbed the stairs to the bedroom, carrying with me the strange sense that something had shifted during the day. Not resolution, that was still coming, but recognition. Recognition that the man who had built a successful business from nothing, who'd constructed houses that still stood decades later, who'd weathered his wife's death without falling apart, was still in there somewhere. He'd just been buried under 3 years of grief, and the mistaken belief that accommodation was the same as love. Tomorrow, I'd begin the process of excavation. Christmas Day arrived with the kind of brutal clarity that winter sometimes brings. Sharp, unforgiving light that makes everything look exactly like what it is, stripped of the softening shadows that might allow for kinder interpretations. I woke at my usual time, made coffee in the quiet kitchen, and began the methodical process of dismantling Christmas. The tree came down, ornament by ornament, each one wrapped carefully in tissue paper, labeled in Caroline's handwriting from years past. Ethan's clay angel, 92. Our first Christmas, ceramic dove. Anniversary ornament, silver bells. The physical act of removing them felt like archaeology, uncovering layers of a family history that apparently meant more to me than to the other surviving member of that family. By noon, the tree was stripped bare, and the ornaments were boxed away in the basement, stored alongside Caroline's Christmas china and the wreaths she'd made by hand. The living room looked larger without the tree, but also emptier, like a stage after the final curtain call. I was carrying the tree to the curb when Tom Henderson pulled into his driveway across the street. He got out of his truck and walked over, wearing the concerned expression of a man who had noticed something amiss. "Taking it down already?" he asked, gesturing toward the tree. "Seemed like the right time." Tom nodded slowly, but his eyes held questions he was too polite to ask. "Eleanor mentioned she invited you for brunch, said you were busy, had some organizing to do." We stood there, in the cold afternoon light, two men of similar age who had lived across from each other for 15 years, but had never moved beyond the comfortable distance of good neighbors. Tom cleared his throat. "Richard, I don't mean to pry, but if you need anything, company, conversation, help with projects around the house, you just say the word. The holidays can be tough when you're on your own." The kindness in his voice nearly undid me. Here was a man I barely knew offering what my own son had withdrawn. "I appreciate that, Tom. More than you know." After he went inside, I stood alone on the sidewalk, looking at the tree lying on its side by the curb. Tomorrow, the city trucks would come and grind it into mulch. Another year's celebration reduced to useful debris. The phone was ringing when I came back inside. I let it ring 3 more times before answering, using the delay to prepare myself for whatever conversation was coming. "Dad, it's Ethan." His voice was tight, controlled, but carrying an undercurrent of something that might have been anger or might have been guilt. Hard to tell the difference sometimes. "Merry Christmas," I said, keeping my tone neutral. "Yeah, Merry Christmas. Listen, Madison's mother wanted me to call. She said you drove by the house yesterday evening. I hadn't realized I had been spotted." "I was driving home from the cemetery. Happened to go past your street." "Right." The word came out flat, disbelieving. "Look, if you're upset about Christmas, I get it, but showing up at our house uninvited, that's not appropriate." Showing up. As if slowing down while driving past constituted some kind of stalking behavior. "I didn't get out of the truck," I said quietly. "That's not the point. The point is that you made Madison's parents uncomfortable. They're guests in our home, and they shouldn't have to worry about being watched." Watched. The word sat in my mouth like something poisonous. In Ethan's version of events, I wasn't a father who'd driven past his son's house on Christmas Eve, possibly hoping for a glimpse of the family gathering he'd been excluded from. I was a lurker, a source of discomfort for people who had more right to be there than I did. I understand, I said, though understanding and accepting were different things entirely. Good. And Dad? We've been talking, Madison and I, and we think it might be best if you gave us some space for a while. Let things cool down. Things? The tension, the awkwardness. You know how it gets when families try to force situations that aren't working. Families trying to force situations. As if my desire to remain part of my son's life was an imposition rather than a natural expectation. How long is a while? I asked. Ethan was quiet for a moment, and I could hear voices in the background. Madison's parents, probably, offering their opinions on how to handle the difficult father-in-law who wouldn't take hints about his diminished welcome. A few months, maybe, until we can figure out a better dynamic. A better dynamic. The phrase was so clinical, so removed from anything resembling familial affection, that it took my breath away. We weren't father and son anymore. We were people with incompatible dynamics who needed time to recalibrate our relationship. I see, I said. It's not permanent, Ethan added quickly, perhaps hearing something in my voice that concerned him. It's just, Madison's family is going through some transitions right now. Her father's retirement didn't go as planned, and they're dealing with some financial pressures. Having to worry about family drama on top of that is just too much stress. Financial pressures. Madison's family was having money troubles, and somehow that made my presence at Christmas dinner impossible to accommodate. The logic was so twisted I almost admired its creativity. And you think I'm the source of this drama? Not intentionally, but things get complicated when different generations try to share the same space. Different expectations, different ways of doing things. Different generations. I was being relegated to a previous era, a relic whose outdated expectations no longer fit with their modern approach to family relationships. Ethan, I said slowly, I want you to listen carefully to what I'm about to say. Dad, listen. The word came out sharper than I'd intended, carrying the authority I'd once used with construction crews who thought they could cut corners on my projects. I've spent 3 years tiptoeing around your schedule, accepting whatever scraps of attention you and Madison were willing to throw my way. I told myself it was patience. I told myself it was respect for your new marriage and your busy life. Silence on the other end. In the background, I could hear a television, probably a football game, the kind of mindless holiday programming that filled the spaces between family conversations. But what you're describing isn't a family relationship, I continued. It's a series of managed encounters designed to minimize inconvenience to people who've decided they're more important than the man who raised one of them and financially supported both of them. Dad, you're being dramatic. Am I? You excluded me from Christmas, then called to scold me for driving past your house on a public street. You want months of space to figure out a better dynamic with your father. Does any of that sound like love to you? Another silence, longer this time. When Ethan spoke again, his voice had lost its practiced patience. Look, I'm trying to be respectful here. I'm trying to handle this without making it ugly. But if you can't accept reasonable boundaries? The word exploded out of me with more force than I'd intended. Son, boundaries are about protecting relationships, not ending them. What you're describing is abandonment dressed up in therapy speak. Jesus, Dad, you're making this so much harder than it needs to be. I'm making it honest. The line went quiet except for the sound of his breathing. When he spoke again, his voice was different, colder, more final. Fine, have it your way. But don't expect me to keep bending over backward to accommodate someone who refuses to adapt to changing circumstances. What circumstances? Your wife's family having money troubles? My inconvenient existence as your father? You know what? We're done here. When you're ready to be reasonable, you can call me. Until then, I think the space will be good for both of us. The line went dead. I set the phone down and stared at it for a long moment, processing what had just happened. Ethan had hung up on me, not in the heat of an argument, but as a calculated dismissal. The conversation was over because he'd decided it was over, and my feelings about that decision were irrelevant. I walked to the living room and stood in the space where the Christmas tree had been that morning. The carpet still bore the indentations from the tree stand, small circular impressions that would fade in a day or two. By next Christmas, there would be no physical evidence that a tree had ever stood there, no reminder of the traditions that had once made this house feel like the center of something meaningful. But I would remember. I would remember every Christmas morning when Ethan had bounded down the stairs like a child, every Christmas Eve when Caroline had read "'Twas the Night Before Christmas" in her gentle voice, every Christmas dinner when our table had been full of laughter and stories, and the kind of easy affection that feels permanent until it's gone. And I would remember this Christmas too, the first one in 70 years when I'd been told I wasn't wanted, the day that had taught me the difference between being alone and being dismissed. As evening settled over the house, I found myself thinking about Caroline's garden, how she'd spent hours planning which plants would complement each other, which ones needed protection from harsh weather, which ones were strong enough to survive on their own. She had understood that not every plant belonged in every garden, that sometimes the kindest thing you could do was recognize when something wasn't thriving and make the difficult decision to transplant it somewhere better suited to its needs. Maybe that's what was happening here. Maybe Ethan and I had simply grown in different directions, developed different requirements for what we needed from a relationship. Maybe the kindest thing I could do, for both of us, was to stop trying to force a connection that no longer felt natural to either of us. The thought should have brought relief, but it didn't. It brought clarity instead, which was harder but more useful. I made myself a simple dinner, eggs and toast, comfort food that required no particular skill or enthusiasm. As I ate, I found myself thinking about the cabin by the lake, about the peace I'd felt sitting there that afternoon. Caroline and I had bought it as a retreat, a place to escape when the world felt too demanding. Now it could be something else, a place to rebuild when the world felt too small. The grandfather clock chimed 9 times as I finished cleaning up. I turned off the kitchen light and made my way upstairs, but instead of going to bed, I stopped at Caroline's desk and pulled out a fresh legal pad. At the top, I wrote, "New Year, New Plan." Below that, I began listing the practical steps I'd need to take. Transfer the lake cabin deed into my name alone, change my mailing address, winterize the cabin for year-round living, sell the house in town or rent it out. The list grew longer as I thought of all the details involved in relocating not just my physical presence, but my entire life. But underneath the practical considerations was something more fundamental, the recognition that I had choices, real choices about how to spend whatever years remained to me. I could continue living in this house, surrounded by memories of better times and tethered to a son who saw me as an inconvenience. Or I could build something new on the foundation Caroline and I had laid together, but never had the chance to fully enjoy. The decision, when it came, felt as natural as breathing. I was going to move to the lake. Not immediately. There was too much to organize, too many details to handle properly. But by spring, when Caroline's garden would normally be coming back to life, I'd be starting over somewhere that held no history of rejection, no echoes of uncomfortable family dynamics. I finished the list and set the pad aside. In the morning, I'd start making calls. To Marcus Henley, the lawyer who had handled our real estate transactions for 20 years. To the utility companies and the post office. To the few friends who would need to know where to reach me. But tonight, I sat in the quiet house and let myself feel the weight of what was ending and the anticipation of what was about to begin. Change had always been Caroline's specialty. She'd rearranged furniture the way other people changed television channels, constantly seeking the perfect configuration of space and light and comfort. Change is just another word for possibility, she'd told me once when I'd grumbled about her latest redecorating project. The trick is knowing when you've outgrown your current arrangement. I'd outgrown this arrangement, I realized, not just the house, but the entire structure of my relationship with Ethan. The careful dance of accommodation and disappointment that had replaced genuine connection. The gradual diminishment of my role in his life from central figure to occasional guest to unwelcome complication. Tomorrow would be different. Tomorrow, I'd start building something that fit the man I was becoming, rather than the man I'd been when my family was intact. The grandfather clock chimed 10 times, then fell silent. The house settled around me with its familiar sounds. The whisper of heated air through vents, the soft creak of wood adjusting to temperature changes, the distant hum of appliances cycling on and off. But for the first time in 3 years, those sounds didn't feel lonely. They felt like possibility taking its first breath. The Christmas that changed everything. The morning after Christmas brought a different kind of silence. Not the expectant quiet of Christmas Eve or the hollow emptiness of Christmas Day, but the focused stillness of a man who'd made a decision and was ready to act on it. I woke before sunrise, as had become my habit, but instead of lying in bed listening to the house breathe around me, I got up immediately and made my way to the kitchen. The coffee pot gurgled to life while I retrieved the legal pad from Caroline's desk. In the gray light before dawn, my handwriting looked foreign, as if someone else had written "New Year, New Plan" across the top of the page. But the list below it was mine, each item a step towards something I couldn't quite name yet, but knew I needed. I added to the list while the coffee brewed. Call Marcus, property transfer. Inventory lake cabin needs. Research mail forwarding. Each task was concrete, measurable, the kind of project planning I'd done thousands of times in construction. Break the job into phases, establish a timeline, execute with precision. By 7, I was dressed and backing out of the driveway. The streets were empty except for a few early commuters and the occasional delivery truck. Most people were still sleeping off Christmas dinner or opening presents with children who'd woken them before sunrise. Normal families doing normal things on the day after Christmas. Marcus Henley's office occupied the second floor of a brick building downtown, the kind of solid, unpretentious space that inspired confidence rather than awe. I'd been coming here for 20 years, first with Caroline for real estate transactions, then alone for will updates and estate planning after her diagnosis. Marcus knew our family history, understood the weight of the decisions I was asking him to help me make. "Richard," he said when his secretary showed me in, "good to see you. How was your Christmas?" "Educational," I said, settling into the chair across from his desk. "Marcus, I need to make some changes." I explained about Christmas, about Ethan's exclusion and subsequent demand for space, about my decision to relocate to the lake cabin. Marcus listened without interruption, occasionally making notes on the legal pad he kept for client consultations. His expression remained neutral, professional, but I caught glimpses of something that might have been sympathy, or might have been recognition of a familiar pattern. "Property transfer is straightforward," he said when I finished. "We'll need to update the deed to reflect Caroline's passing, then we can discuss the house. Are you planning to sell or maintain it as an investment property?" "Haven't decided yet. For now, I just want to be clear about ownership. Everything in my name alone." Marcus nodded and pulled a folder from his filing cabinet. "We should also review your will, power of attorney documents, healthcare directives. Make sure everything reflects your current circumstances and wishes." The phrase hung in the air between us. Current circumstances. A polite way of acknowledging that my family situation had fundamentally changed, that the documents we'd crafted when I was a husband and active father might no longer serve the man I was becoming. "There's something else," I said. "I want to understand my options if someone tries to challenge my competency or my right to make decisions about my own property." Marcus's pen stopped moving. He looked up, his expression sharper now. "Has someone suggested you're not competent to manage your affairs?" "Not directly, but I want to be prepared." "Richard, you're 70 years old, not 90. You're in good health, you manage a successful business, you live independently. Unless there's evidence of cognitive decline or mental instability, no one can challenge your right to make your own decisions. And if they tried anyway, they'd need medical evidence, testimony from multiple sources, proof that you're a danger to yourself or others. It's a high bar to clear, and frankly, from what I have observed over the years, you're one of the most competent people I know." The validation felt good, but I pressed further. What if I wanted to make it even harder for someone to interfere? What options do I have? Marcus leaned back in his chair, studying me with the careful attention he reserved for complex legal problems. "You could establish a revocable trust. Transfer your assets into it with yourself as trustee. It accomplishes the same thing as individual ownership during your lifetime, but provides additional protection against challenges or interference. Do it." "Richard, these are significant decisions. You might want to take some time." "I've taken 3 years," I interrupted. "That's enough time." We spent the next 2 hours going through paperwork, updating beneficiaries, clarifying my wishes for medical care, and property distribution. It felt strange, planning for my own decline and death, but also strangely liberating. These were my choices, my decisions about my own life. No one else's input was required or welcome. "One more thing," Marcus said as we finished. "Given what you've told me about your son's attitude, you might want to consider reducing his inheritance expectations. Not out of spite, but to prevent future conflicts if he's already showing signs of entitlement to your property. The suggestion hit me harder than I'd expected. Reducing Ethan's inheritance meant acknowledging that our estrangement might be permanent, that the hope I'd carried for reconciliation was perhaps naive. "Let me think about that," I said. "Of course. But Richard, if you're serious about protecting your autonomy, you need to think about all the ways someone might try to exert control over you. Financial expectations can be powerful motivators for bad behavior." I drove home through streets that were busier now, people venturing out for after-Christmas sales or visiting relatives they'd missed the day before. The normalcy of it, families loading shopping bags into cars, children dragging new toys across snowy yards, felt like watching a movie about a life I'd once lived but could no longer access. Back home, I walked through the house with new eyes, seeing it not as the repository of 40 years of memories, but as an asset that required management. The kitchen Caroline and I had remodeled 5 years ago. The hardwood floors we'd refinished ourselves one humid summer. The stone fireplace I'd built by hand during our second winter here. All of it represented thousands of hours of work, tens of thousands of dollars in improvements, a lifetime of careful stewardship. And according to my son, it was now a source of tension that interfered with his wife's family dynamics. I made a sandwich I didn't finish and sat at Caroline's desk to update my planning notes. The legal pad was filling quickly with tasks and timelines and the practical considerations of relocating a life. But underneath the logistics was a growing sense of something I hadn't felt in years: control. For 3 years, I'd been reactive, responding to other people's schedules and expectations, accommodating their comfort at the expense of my own. Grief had made me passive, had convinced me that keeping peace was the same as preserving relationships. But peace maintained through constant accommodation wasn't peace at all. It was surrender disguised as compromise. The phone rang while I was organizing Caroline's financial files. Ethan's name appeared on the caller ID, and for a moment I considered not answering, but curiosity won. "Dad, I've been thinking about our conversation this morning." His tone was different now, less authoritative, more uncertain. Perhaps he'd had time to process the implications of what he'd said. Or perhaps Madison had pointed out the potential consequences of completely alienating a father who'd been financially generous over the years. "Have you?" "Yeah, and maybe I was a little harsh. This whole situation with Madison's family has everyone on edge." "I'm sure it does. The thing is, her parents really are in a bind. Her father's pension isn't what they thought it would be, and they're looking at downsizing, maybe even selling their house. It's a lot of stress for Madison watching her parents struggle." I waited for him to continue, but the silence stretched until I realized he expected me to fill it with understanding, with offers to help, with the kind of automatic generosity I had shown for years. "That's unfortunate," I said instead. "Dad, I know you're upset about Christmas, but maybe this could actually work out for everyone. Madison's parents need a place to stay while they figure things out, and you've got that lake cabin sitting empty most of the time." There it was, the real reason for this follow-up call. Christmas hadn't been about space limitations or family dynamics. It had been about positioning me for a request I couldn't refuse because refusing would make me the selfish family member who prioritized his own comfort over people in need. "You want me to let Madison's parents live at the cabin?" "Not permanently, just until they get back on their feet. 6 months, maybe a year. You barely use the place anyway." The casual dismissal of my attachment to the property that Caroline and I had chosen together had furnished with pieces that reflected our shared vision of retirement, stung worse than the Christmas exclusion. In Ethan's calculation, my emotional connection to the cabin was irrelevant compared to the practical needs of his in-laws. "And what do I get out of this arrangement?" The question seemed to catch him off guard. "What do you mean?" "I mean, what's my incentive to hand over property that belongs to me to people I barely know?" "They're family now, Dad. When Madison and I got married, Madison's family became your family," I interrupted. "That doesn't automatically make them mine. Family is earned through relationship, through care, through showing up. It's not a title that gets transferred through marriage certificates." Another silence. When Ethan spoke again, his voice carried the edge of a man whose careful strategy was unraveling. "I can't believe how selfish you're being. We're talking about helping people who really need it, and you're worried about your property rights?" I'm worried about being manipulated by people who exclude me from Christmas dinner and then call the next day asking for favors. It's not manipulation. It's family helping family. Then where was this family when I spent Christmas alone? Where was this family when I needed help getting through the first holiday season after your mother died? The words came out harder than I'd intended, carrying 3 years of accumulated grief and disappointment, but they were also true, and truth had been in short supply in our recent conversations. That's different, Ethan said, but his voice lacked conviction. How is it different? You chose to spend Christmas alone. We invited you to. You excluded me from your Christmas celebration, and then suggested I find somewhere else to be. That's not the same as inviting me to join your family. I could hear voices in the background again. Madison, probably, asking what was taking so long, wondering why her father-in-law was being so difficult about such a reasonable request. Look, Ethan said, his voice dropping to the tone he'd use with a stubborn client. We're all adults here. We can work this out rationally. What would it take for you to consider letting them use the cabin? The question hung in the air like smoke. What would it take? An apology for Christmas? An acknowledgement that excluding me had been wrong? An invitation to actually be part of their family rather than a convenient source of assistance when needed? But as I sat there in Caroline's chair, surrounded by the remnants of our life together, I realized that none of those things would be enough. Because even if Ethan apologized, even if he invited me to every future gathering, the fundamental dynamic wouldn't change. I would still be the father who had to earn his welcome in his son's life, who had to prove his worth through usefulness rather than simply being loved for who he was. There's nothing you could offer, I said quietly, because this isn't a negotiation. Dad, this is you telling me who you are, Ethan, and me finally listening. I hung up before he could respond. Outside, the December wind rattled the windows and sent dry leaves skittering across the driveway. But inside, the house felt calmer than it had in months. I'd stopped pretending that accommodation was love, that giving people what they wanted was the same as being valued by them. Tomorrow, I'd call Marcus and begin the legal work of disentangling my life from Ethan's expectations. I'd start the process of moving to the lake, where Caroline and I had planned to spend our golden years before cancer stole that possibility from us. I wouldn't be spending those years with her, but I'd be spending them on my own terms, in a place that held our shared dreams rather than my solitary disappointments. For the first time since Christmas Eve, I felt something that might have been peace. January arrived with the kind of cold that makes promises, stay inside, stay warm, stay small. But I'd spent the first week of the new year doing exactly the opposite. By January 7th, I'd met with Marcus 3 times, signed papers that transferred the lake cabin into my name alone, and begun the process of establishing a trust that would make it much harder for anyone to challenge my decisions about my own property. The house felt different with boxes stacked in corners and furniture covered in dust sheets. I'd started the sorting process methodically, the way I'd approach any large construction project. Keep, donate, store, discard. Each item evaluated not for its sentimental value, everything in this house had that, but for its place in whatever life I was building next. Caroline's china went into storage. The good pieces deserved better than being packed away, but they also deserved better than gathering dust in a house that would soon be empty. Someday, if Ethan ever had children, maybe they'd want their grandmother's wedding china. Or maybe they wouldn't. And that was something I'd deal with when the time came. The furniture was harder. The dining room table where we'd hosted Thanksgiving dinners for 20 years. The couch where Caroline had curled up every evening with her knitting. The grandfather clock that had marked time for our entire marriage. These weren't just possessions. They were the infrastructure of a life shared. But life had changed, and infrastructure needed to change with it. I was wrapping Caroline's favorite lamp in bubble wrap when the phone rang. An unknown number, but the area code was local. Mr. Dalton, this is Patricia Monroe, Madison's mother. The voice was cultured, carefully modulated, with the kind of practiced warmth that suggested years of experience managing difficult conversations. I set down the bubble wrap and gave her my full attention. Mrs. Monroe, I hope you don't mind me calling directly. Madison gave me your number. I wanted to speak with you about the misunderstanding over Christmas. Misunderstanding, as if my exclusion from their family celebration had been a simple miscommunication rather than a deliberate choice. I'm not sure what there is to misunderstand, I said carefully. Well, that's exactly what I was hoping to clear up. You see, Richard, may I call you Richard, when Ethan mentioned keeping Christmas small, I don't think he communicated very well what we were hoping for. And what was that? Her laugh was musical, practiced. We were hoping to surprise you, actually. Gerald and I have been so grateful for all the support you've given Ethan and Madison over the years. We wanted to do something special for you in return. The words were smooth, but they carried the particular kind of insincerity that comes from stories assembled after the fact, to cover tracks that have already been laid. Surprise me how? We've been looking at options for a more comfortable living arrangement for you. Assisted living communities, senior-friendly condominiums, places where you could have companionship and support without the burden of maintaining that big house all by yourself. There it was, the real agenda, wrapped in concern for my welfare and tied with a bow of family obligation. They hadn't excluded me from Christmas to spare their guests comfort. They'd excluded me because they were planning to rearrange my entire life, and my presence at their celebration would have complicated the narrative they were constructing. I see, I said, my voice steady despite the anger building in my chest. We've found some wonderful places, Richard. Sunnybrook Manor has beautiful grounds and organized activities. Willowdale Estates has golf and a community center. You'd have people your own age to socialize with, medical staff available if needed, and none of the worry about yard work or home repairs. The institutional names rolled off her tongue like items on a shopping list. She'd clearly done research, had probably toured facilities, maybe even filled out applications, all without consulting me about whether I wanted to be institutionalized. And the house? Well, that's where we thought we could help each other. Gerald's retirement didn't go quite as planned. You know how uncertain the economy has been, and we're facing some transitions of our own. Ethan mentioned that you have a lovely lake property that sits empty most of the time. The pieces fell into place with stunning clarity. This wasn't about my welfare or their financial troubles separately. It was a coordinated solution that would solve multiple problems at once, get me out of the family picture, provide them with free housing, and eliminate any inconvenient emotions I might have about preserving the life Caroline and I had built together. So you'd like me to move to an assisted living facility so you can live in my lake cabin, I said, making sure I understood the complete proposal. It would be temporary, of course, just until we find our footing. And really, Richard, wouldn't it be nice to have people around again? To not have to worry about cooking and cleaning and all those daily tasks that get harder as we get older? I walked to the kitchen window while she spoke, looking out at the bird feeder I'd filled that morning. A cardinal sat on the perch, the same bright red that Caroline had loved, the same species she'd insisted brought messages from beyond. I watched it eat steadily, unbothered by the cold wind that rattled the bare branches around it. Mrs. Monroe, I said when she paused for breath, I appreciate your concern, but I'm not interested in moving to an assisted living facility, and my lake property isn't available for temporary housing arrangements. The warmth in her voice cooled noticeably. Richard, I think you might be misunderstanding the scope of what we're offering. This isn't just about housing. It's about family taking care of family, making sure everyone has what they need. Everyone except me, apparently. That's not fair. We're trying to help you. You're trying to help yourselves to my property while convincing me it's for my own good. Silence stretched across the line. When she spoke again, the practiced warmth was gone, replaced by something sharper and more honest. Richard, you're a 70-year-old widower living alone in a house that's too big for you. You have no close friends, no social support network, no activities beyond puttering around that garage of yours. We're offering you a chance to be part of a real community, to have purpose again. Each word was calculated to cut. The assessment of my life as empty and purposeless, the dismissal of my work and interests as puttering, the suggestion that community could only be found in institutional settings rather than the neighborhood where I'd lived for 40 years. And in return, I give up my independence and my property. You give up isolation and anxiety about maintaining a lifestyle that's no longer sustainable. I closed my eyes and thought about Caroline's voice, her gentle way of cutting through manipulation with simple truth. Mrs. Monroe, let me be very clear. I will not be moving to assisted living. I will not be making my lake cabin available to you or your husband. And I will not be discussing this topic again. You're being unreasonable. I'm being decisive. There's a difference. I hung up before she could respond and immediately called Marcus. We need to accelerate the trust establishment, I told him. And I want to explore options for protecting my property from any future claims or interference. Richard, what happened? I described Patricia Monroe's call, the coordinated nature of their proposal, the assumption that I could be maneuvered into giving up both my home and my independence for the sake of their convenience. Aggressive, Marcus said when I finished, and probably premature. If they're already talking about assisted living and property transfers, they're showing their hand too early. What do you mean? I mean, they're not just hoping you'll cooperate. They're planning for the possibility that you won't. People don't research assisted living facilities for other people unless they're prepared to explore ways to make those arrangements mandatory. The word sent a chill through me that had nothing to do with the January weather. You think they might try to have me declared incompetent? I think they're building a case for it. The narrative is already there. Isolated elderly widower, no support system, living alone in a house too big to maintain safely. Add in some carefully documented incidents of confusion or poor judgment, and you've got the foundation for a competency challenge. I thought about Ethan's phone calls over the past months. The way he had sometimes asked me the same question twice, as if testing my memory. The concerned comments about my driving, my cooking, my ability to manage the house maintenance. I'd interpreted it as care, but now I wondered if it had been intelligence gathering. How do we prevent that? We document everything. Every conversation, every interaction, every attempt at pressure or manipulation. We get current medical evaluations showing your cognitive function is normal. We establish the trust immediately, so your property is protected, even if someone challenges your competency. And we make sure you're never in a position where they can manufacture evidence of decline or confusion. By evening, I'd made 3 more decisions. First, I was installing a security system in the house. Not because I feared break-ins, but because I wanted a record of who visited and when. Second, I was scheduling a complete physical and cognitive evaluation with Dr. Sarah Mitchell, who'd been treating me since Caroline's diagnosis. Third, I was accelerating my timeline for moving to the lake. The next morning brought another visitor. I saw the car pull into my driveway through the kitchen window, a silver sedan I didn't recognize. The woman who got out was well-dressed, middle-aged, carrying a briefcase, and moving with the purposeful stride of someone conducting business. I watched from the window as she approached the front door, noting the way she paused to look at the house's exterior, her eyes scanning the windows and the condition of the siding. When she knocked, I let her wait long enough to demonstrate that I wasn't eager for whatever conversation she wanted to have. "Mr. Dalton, my name is Jennifer Walsh from Caring Transitions Senior Services. I understand you might be exploring residential options for active seniors." I didn't open the door. "Who told you that?" "Your family reached out to us. They mentioned you might be interested in learning about communities that specialize in independent living with support services available when needed." Your family. Not Ethan specifically, not Madison, but your family. As if this were a collective decision that had been made on my behalf rather than a campaign to relocate me against my will. "I'm not interested," I said through the door. "Of course, these decisions can feel overwhelming. That's completely natural. But perhaps I could just leave some information for you to review at your own pace. No pressure, just educational materials about options that might enhance your quality of life." I opened the door just wide enough to see her clearly. She was younger than I'd initially thought, probably mid-40s, with the kind of professional smile that had been trained rather than earned. "Ms. Walsh, my family doesn't speak for me about my living arrangements. I haven't authorized anyone to contact senior housing services on my behalf, and I'm not interested in exploring residential alternatives to my own home." Her smile faltered slightly. "I see. There may have been some miscommunication then, but since I'm here, perhaps we could discuss—" We could not. I closed the door and watched through the window as she returned to her car, making notes on a clipboard. She sat in the driveway for several minutes, probably calling Ethan to report her lack of success. That afternoon, I drove to the electronics store and purchased a basic security system. 4 cameras, motion detectors, a central hub that would alert me to any unusual activity. The young salesman was enthusiastic about the smart home features, the ability to monitor everything remotely, the integration with phone apps that would let me see my property from anywhere. "Most seniors find these systems really empowering," he said, as he rang up the purchase. "It's like having eyes in the back of your head." Seniors, Even here, my age was being used to categorize me, to suggest that surveillance was particularly necessary for someone my generation. But he wasn't wrong about the empowerment aspect. Knowledge was power, and I intended to know exactly who was coming and going from my property. The installation took most of the next day. I positioned cameras to cover all the approaches to the house, motion sensors to detect activity near the windows and doors, and a master control unit in Caroline's study where I could monitor everything from a comfortable chair. When I finished, I tested the system by walking the perimeter of the house, watching myself on the small monitor screen. It felt strange, seeing my own property through the lens of suspicion. But Caroline would have understood. She'd always been practical about protecting what mattered. That evening, I called Dr. Mitchell and scheduled a comprehensive physical for the following week. "Is everything all right, Richard?" she asked. "You sound concerned." "I'm being proactive," I said. "I want current documentation of my physical and mental health, complete evaluation, cognitive testing if necessary." "That's certainly wise, though I have to say, from what I've observed during your regular visits, you seem to be managing very well. Your cardiac health is stable, your medication compliance is excellent, and you've shown no signs of cognitive decline. I'd like that officially documented." She agreed to schedule the full battery of tests, including a referral to a neuropsychologist for cognitive evaluation. By the time we finished our conversation, I'd have medical documentation that would make any competency challenge extremely difficult to pursue. The next day brought the first test of my new security system. I was in the garage organizing tools for the move to the lake when my phone alerted me to motion at the front door. The camera showed a man in his 50s, well-dressed, carrying a folder and moving with the confident bearing of someone accustomed to being welcomed into other people's homes. I let him knock twice before answering. "Mr. Dalton, I'm Robert Crawford from Heritage Estate Planning. Your son mentioned you might be interested in discussing some financial arrangements." Through the door, I could see him glance at the security camera, then back at the door with a slight frown. "Mr. Crawford, I have an estate attorney. I haven't authorized anyone to contact additional financial services on my behalf. Of course, I understand your caution, but estate planning is complex, especially when family dynamics are involved. Sometimes a fresh perspective can identify opportunities that might have been overlooked, such as, well, tax optimization strategies, legacy planning that benefits multiple generations, ways to ensure your assets are protected and distributed according to your true wishes, rather than default probate procedures." The language was smooth, professional, designed to suggest that my current arrangements were somehow inadequate or naive. But underneath the polished presentation was the same assumption that had driven all these recent interactions, that I was a problem to be solved rather than a person to be respected. "Mr. Crawford, I'm not interested in revising my estate planning. My current arrangements suit my needs perfectly." "I understand, but your son seemed quite concerned about some of the complexities involved, particularly with regard to property that might be better utilized by family members who could benefit from it now rather than waiting for inheritance." Property that might be better utilized. The lake cabin, obviously. Ethan had sent this man to convince me that giving up my retreat was somehow in my own best interests, dressed up as sophisticated financial planning. "My son doesn't determine my financial decisions," I said firmly. "Of course not, but family harmony can be an important consideration when structuring estate plans. Sometimes small adjustments now can prevent larger conflicts later." I opened the door wide enough to look him directly in the eye. "Mr. Crawford, let me save you some time. I will not be adjusting my estate plan to accommodate my son's convenience or his wife's family's housing needs. I will not be transferring property to people who haven't earned it. And I will not be taking financial advice from someone who was hired to pressure me into decisions that benefit other people at my expense." His professional smile finally cracked. "Sir, I think there's been some misunderstanding. The only misunderstanding was my son thinking I was too old or too grief-stricken to recognize manipulation when it came wrapped in concern for my welfare." I closed the door and watched through the camera as he returned to his car, speaking animatedly into his phone. Another failure to report back to Ethan. Another strategy that had underestimated the man they were dealing with. The pattern was becoming clear. They weren't just pressuring me directly. They were building a paper trail that would support a narrative of decline and incapacity. Estate planners concerned about my financial judgment, senior housing specialists documenting my social isolation, probably medical consultants next, expressing concern about an elderly man living alone without adequate support. But I was building my own paper trail, security footage of unwanted visitors, recorded calls from people claiming family authorization to make decisions about my life, medical evaluations that would prove beyond doubt that I was mentally sharp and perfectly capable of managing my own affairs. By the end of January, I'd finished most of the house preparations. The trust was established and funded, with Marcus as successor trustee and detailed instructions about my wishes for the property. The lake cabin was winterized and ready for year-round occupancy. Most importantly, I'd stopped answering calls from numbers I didn't recognize. The silence was profound. For weeks, my phone had buzzed constantly with calls from various service providers, all claiming family authorization to discuss my needs. Now, screening my calls, the house felt peaceful in a way it hadn't since Caroline's death. But Ethan wasn't done trying. The letter arrived on February 3rd, handwritten on expensive stationery that probably belonged to Madison. The script was careful, measured, designed to appear heartfelt rather than calculated. Dad, I know we've had some misunderstandings lately, and I take responsibility for not communicating clearly about what our family is going through. Madison's parents are facing some serious financial difficulties, more serious than I initially let on. They're not just looking for temporary housing, they're looking at bankruptcy, possibly losing their home entirely. As their son-in-law, I feel obligated to help however I can. I was hoping we could find a way to work together on this, to be the kind of family Mom would have wanted us to be. Could we meet for lunch this week? I'd like to explain the situation properly and see if we might find some common ground. Your son, Ethan. The letter was skillfully written. I had to give him credit for that. The acknowledgement of miscommunication without accepting responsibility for exclusion. The escalation of his in-laws' problems from inconvenience to crisis. The invocation of Caroline's memory as justification for whatever he was about to propose. And the signature, your son, Ethan, as if our biological relationship was a trump card that overrode any objections I might raise. I read it twice, then placed it in the folder where I'd been keeping documentation of all contact from Ethan and his representatives. Marcus had advised me to save everything, to create a record that would demonstrate the pressure campaign they were conducting. But I didn't call Ethan back. Instead, I drove to the lake. The cabin looked beautiful in the February light, snow-covered and peaceful, smoke rising from the chimney of the neighboring property where someone was obviously spending their winter. I'd been making regular trips to check on the place, ensuring the pipes didn't freeze, testing the generator, gradually moving essential items from the house and town. Today, I brought Caroline's reading chair, the one from our living room where she'd spent countless evenings with her knitting and her books. It fit perfectly in the cabin's main room, positioned to look out over the lake where ice was beginning to form intricate patterns along the shore. I sat in the chair and opened the folder I'd brought. All the documentation of Ethan's campaign to relocate me, Patricia Monroe's phone call about assisted living, Jennifer Walsh's uninvited visit to discuss senior housing, Robert Crawford's estate planning consultation, Ethan's letter invoking Caroline's memory to justify helping his in-laws at my expense. The strategy was clear, and it was sophisticated. Create a narrative of decline and isolation, offer solutions that appear generous while serving their own interests, invoke family obligation to override any resistance I might mount. If I'd been the broken, grieving man they'd assumed I was, it might have worked. But grief had clarified rather than clouded my thinking. Caroline's death had stripped away the illusions I'd maintained about family loyalty, about blood being thicker than self-interest, about love being stronger than convenience. I pulled out a legal pad and began writing. Not a response to Ethan's letter, but something else entirely. At the top, I wrote, Clearwater Lake Veterans Retreat. Below that, I began outlining a plan that had been forming in the back of my mind since my first conversation with Marcus. Caroline had always wanted to do something meaningful with the lake property, had talked about it becoming a place of healing for people who needed it more than we did. She had mentioned veterans specifically, men and women who had served their country and then struggled to find peace when they came home. What if the cabin became exactly that? What if, instead of allowing Ethan to pressure me into giving it to his in-laws, I donated it to an organization that would use it for veteran retreats? It would accomplish multiple goals at once, preserve Caroline's vision for the property, ensure it would be used for something meaningful, and make it legally impossible for Ethan or anyone else to claim it for their own purposes. The more I thought about it, the more right it felt. Not as revenge against Ethan, but as fulfillment of something Caroline and I had dreamed about but never had the chance to implement. I spent the afternoon researching veteran support organizations, making calls, learning about the legal requirements for property donation. By evening, I had the framework for a plan that would honor Caroline's memory, serve people who truly deserved support, and remove the lake property from Ethan's calculations permanently. The drive home took me past Ethan's neighborhood again. This time, I didn't slow down or turn onto his street. I had better things to do than spy on people who'd made it clear I wasn't welcome in their lives. But as I passed the turn that would lead to his house, I found myself smiling for the first time in weeks. Not from happiness, there wasn't much of that yet, but from anticipation. Ethan thought he was playing chess, moving pieces around the board to achieve checkmate against an opponent he'd underestimated. But he had made a fundamental error in his strategy. He'd assumed I was still playing by the old rules, where family loyalty meant accepting whatever treatment he chose to dish out, where being a good father meant enabling whatever plans he'd made for my future. Tomorrow, I'd show him how wrong he was. Tomorrow, I'd start playing by my own rules. The call from Marcus came on a Tuesday morning in late February, while I was having coffee at the lake cabin's kitchen table. Through the window, I could see ice fishermen setting up their shelters on the far side of the lake, tiny figures moving against the white expanse like pieces on a board game. "Richard, the paperwork is complete," Marcus said without preamble. "Clearwater Lake Veterans Retreat is now officially established as a 501c3 organization, and the property transfer is recorded with the county. As of this morning, you no longer own the cabin." I set down my coffee mug and felt something settle in my chest. Not relief exactly, but the satisfaction of a job completed properly. "And my access rights?" "Protected in perpetuity. You're listed as the founding donor with lifetime residence privileges. You can live there as long as you choose, but legally, it belongs to the Veterans Organization. No one can force a sale, claim inheritance rights, or challenge your decision to donate it." "Perfect. Richard, I have to ask, are you sure about this? It's a significant financial decision, and while I understand your motivations, you're giving up a substantial asset." I looked around the cabin's main room, where Caroline's chair sat positioned to catch the morning light, where her books still lined the shelves, where the quilt she'd never finished waited in its basket. This wasn't a financial decision. This was a choice about legacy, about ensuring that what Caroline and I had built together would serve a purpose larger than our individual needs. "I'm sure," I said. The news broke faster than I'd expected. The local paper picked up the story first. Local business owner donates lake property for veteran support, complete with a photograph of the cabin and quotes from the Veterans Organization about their gratitude. Within hours, the story had been shared on social media, commented on by friends and neighbors who remembered Caroline's community spirit and saw the donation as a fitting memorial. My phone began ringing by noon. Tom Henderson from across the street calling to congratulate me. Dr. Mitchell's office asking if I needed any additional documentation for the donation tax benefits. 3 different neighbors who had known Caroline, all expressing how proud she would have been. But the call I was waiting for came at 2:17 p.m. Ethan's number flashed on my screen, and I let it ring twice before answering. "Dad?" His voice was tight, controlled, but carrying an undercurrent of something between disbelief and fury. "I just saw the news." "Did you? You donated the lake cabin to strangers, to veterans, people who've served their country and deserve a place to heal." Silence stretched across the line. I could hear him breathing, could almost hear him calculating the financial implications of what I'd done. That property was supposed to be part of my inheritance. The words hung in the air like an admission of guilt. Not, "Dad, why didn't you discuss this with me?" or, "I'm concerned about your decision-making." Just the blunt statement that he'd been counting my assets as his future property. Supposed to be according to whom? According to, "It's family property. Mom loved that place. You can't just give it away to people who have no connection to our family history. Your mother wanted that property to serve people who needed healing. That's exactly what it's doing now. She wanted it to be our family retreat, our place. When did you last visit there, Ethan? When did you last show any interest in preserving what your mother loved about it?" Another silence, longer this time. The answer was obvious to both of us. Ethan hadn't been to the lake cabin since Caroline's funeral. He'd shown no interest in the property except as a potential solution to his in-laws' housing problems. "This is about Christmas, isn't it?" he said finally. "You're punishing me for Christmas." I almost laughed. The narcissism was breathtaking. The assumption that every decision I made was somehow centered on him, motivated by reaction to his behavior rather than thoughtful consideration of my own needs and values. "This is about honoring your mother's memory in a way that matters, something you seem to have forgotten how to do." "Don't," his voice sharpened. "Don't you dare talk to me about Mom's memory. Everything I've done has been about family, about keeping us together, about making sure everyone is taken care of. Everyone except me." "Jesus, Dad, you're 70 years old. How much longer are you planning to hold on to stuff you can't even use properly? How much longer are you going to be stubborn about accepting help when you need it?" The mask was slipping now. The concerned son act was giving way to something uglier: resentment, entitlement, the belief that my advanced age somehow diminished my right to make decisions about my own property. "I don't need help, Ethan. I need respect. And since you seem incapable of providing that, I've found people who are." "What's that supposed to mean?" "It means I've donated property that you assume would someday be yours to people who've actually earned it through service and sacrifice. It means I've chosen to support veterans who understand duty and honor rather than family members who confuse manipulation with love." The silence that followed was absolute. No background noise, no sound of breathing, just dead owls, dead air across the connection. When Ethan spoke again, his voice was cold, flat, empty of any pretense of filial affection. "You're going to regret this. When you're lying in some nursing home because you're too proud to accept help from family, when you're alone and forgotten because you drove away the only people who cared about you, you're going to remember this conversation." "Ethan," I said quietly, "the only thing I regret is how long it took me to see who you really are." I hung up and immediately called Marcus to report the conversation. "Threatening language," he said, after I described Ethan's final words. "We'll add it to the documentation. Richard, I think you should expect this to escalate. People don't usually respond well to having their expectations thwarted so completely. Let it escalate. I'm ready." That evening, I packed the last of Caroline's china into storage boxes. Each piece wrapped carefully, labeled precisely, stored with the attention to detail she would have demanded. The house was nearly empty now, stripped of everything except the essentials I'd need for the few remaining weeks before the move to the lake. But as I worked, I found myself thinking about Ethan's words. Not the threats about nursing homes and abandonment. Those were just the desperate lashing out of a man whose carefully constructed plans had crumbled. But his accusation that I was punishing him for Christmas, that my decisions were motivated by revenge rather than principle. Was that true? Was I giving away the lake cabin to hurt him or to honor Caroline? I sat in the living room, surrounded by boxes and covered furniture, and considered the question honestly. There was satisfaction in thwarting Ethan's schemes, no question about that. There was justice in ensuring that people who had tried to manipulate me wouldn't benefit from their efforts. But underneath those motivations was something purer, the recognition that Caroline's dreams for the property deserved better than being bartered away to solve other people's problems. She had envisioned it as a place of peace, of healing, of service to something larger than our individual needs. Donating it to veterans accomplished exactly what she'd hoped for, in a way that neither Ethan's indifference nor his in-laws' financial desperation could have achieved. The grandfather clock chimed 9 times. The last time it would mark hours in this house. Tomorrow, the movers would come to transport it to the cabin, where it would continue its patient measurement of time in a place that honored the woman who'd chosen it at an estate sale 30 years ago. My phone buzzed with a text message, Madison's number, which surprised me. We'd rarely communicated directly. "Richard, I think there's been a huge misunderstanding. Could we please sit down and talk? I feel like if we could just have an honest conversation, we could work this out. Family should be able to work things out." The message was carefully crafted, hitting all the right notes. Acknowledgement of miscommunication, appeal for dialogue, invocation of family bonds, but it came days too late and from the wrong person. Madison had been content to let Ethan handle the Richard situation when they'd thought they could manage me through exclusion and manipulation. Now that I'd removed their primary asset from consideration, suddenly she wanted honest conversation. I didn't reply immediately. Instead, I walked through the empty house one last time, checking that windows were secure, that the heat was set low enough to prevent pipes from freezing, but not so low as to damage the structure. These would be my responsibilities until the house sold, whenever that happened. In the bedroom, I stood before the dresser where Caroline's jewelry box remained exactly as she'd left it. I'd packed everything else, but this had seemed too personal for storage, too precious for the casual handling that a move would require. I opened it and touched the pearl necklace one last time. Caroline had worn it on special occasions. Anniversaries, Christmas dinners, Ethan's graduation, his wedding. It belonged to a time when our family had felt permanent, when traditions had seemed unbreakable, when I'd believed that love was stronger than convenience. Now it felt like an artifact from someone else's life. I closed the jewelry box and placed it in the final moving carton, wrapping it in one of Caroline's scarves for protection. Tomorrow, it would travel to the lake, where it would sit on a different dresser in a different bedroom, holding memories that would always be precious but no longer painful. At 9 o'clock, I finally replied to Madison's text. "Madison, I appreciate your concern, but there's nothing to work out. The property transfer is complete and irrevocable. I wish you and your parents well in finding solutions to your housing situation, but those solutions won't involve me." Her response came within minutes. "You're destroying this family. Is that really what Caroline would have wanted?" The invocation of Caroline's name, not as mom or your wife, but as a weapon to be wielded against me, crystallized everything I'd come to understand about these people. They would use anything, even the memory of the woman I'd loved for 43 years, to get what they wanted. I deleted the conversation without replying and blocked Madison's number. The next morning, the movers arrived at 7 sharp. Professional, efficient, they transformed the accumulation of 40 years into numbered boxes and wrapped furniture in under 4 hours. I followed behind them, checking that nothing was forgotten, that each room had been properly cleared. The house looked bigger empty, but also somehow smaller, like a shell from which the essential substance had been removed. I walked through it one final time, my footsteps echoing in rooms that had once been full of conversation and laughter and the comfortable sounds of a shared life. In the kitchen, I paused at the window where I had watched Caroline tend her garden every morning. The beds were dormant now, covered with snow, but underneath the frozen ground, her perennials waited for spring. Someone else would see them bloom. Someone else would enjoy the succession of colors she'd planned with such care. The thought should have made me sad, but it didn't. It made me hopeful. Caroline's garden would outlive our residence here, would continue bringing beauty into the world long after we'd moved on. Just like the lake cabin would continue serving people who needed healing, who deserved a place to rest and recover from service their country. Some legacies were more important than family continuity. I locked the front door and placed the key in the lockbox for the realtor. The security system would remain active until the house sold, monitoring an empty structure that held 40 years of memories, but no longer held me. The drive to the lake took 35 minutes through countryside that was stark and beautiful in its winter bareness. I'd made this drive hundreds of times with Caroline, planning our retirement, dreaming about the quiet mornings we'd share by the water. Now I was making it alone, but not lonely. Hopeful, perhaps, for the first time since she'd died. The cabin welcomed me with the scent of wood smoke and the coffee I'd left brewing on a timer. Through the windows, Clearwater Lake stretched toward the horizon, ice patterns catching the afternoon light like fractured crystal. This would be my view now. This would be home. I unpacked Caroline's jewelry box first, placing it on the bedroom dresser where the morning sun would touch it each day. Then I positioned the grandfather clock in the main room, where its steady chimes would mark the hours of whatever time remained to me. As evening settled over the lake, I built a fire and sat in Caroline's chair with a cup of coffee that actually tasted good for the first time in months. The phone lay silent on the table beside me. No unknown numbers calling with unwanted services. No family members demanding conferences about my lifestyle choices. Just the quiet crackling of burning wood and the distant sound of wind across open water. I'd won, I realized. Not through anger or revenge, but through the simple act of choosing dignity over accommodation, principle over family peace. Ethan could rage about lost inheritance. Madison could invoke Caroline's memory. Patricia Monroe could research assisted living facilities until her eyes bled. None of it mattered anymore. The lake cabin was beyond their reach, protected by law, and serving a purpose larger than their small ambitions. And I was exactly where I belonged, surrounded by the life Caroline and I had chosen together, but I would finish alone. It wasn't the future I'd planned when she was alive, when Ethan was the boy who brought her wildflowers and helped me build the tire swing that still hung from the oak tree at our old house. But it was my future, chosen rather than imposed, earned rather than inherited. The grandfather clock chimed 9 times, marking another day in what felt like the first chapter of something new, rather than the final chapter of something ending. Outside, snow began to fall across the dark water, each flake visible in the glow from the cabin's windows before disappearing into the vast silence of the lake. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges. The Veterans Organization would want to tour the property, discuss their plans, begin the process of transforming Caroline's retreat into something that served people who truly needed it. But tonight, I was exactly where I wanted to be, doing exactly what felt right, accountable to no one but the woman whose memory sat in the chair beside me, and the conscience that had finally learned to speak louder than the desire to keep everyone else happy. Some battles end not with victory parades, but with quiet satisfaction and the peaceful settling of a well-built fire. This was one of those battles. Spring came early to Clearwater Lake, ice retreating in lazy fingers toward the deep center, while the shoreline revealed itself in shades of brown and green that grew richer each day. I'd been living at the cabin for 2 months now, long enough for the rhythms of lake life to replace the suburban schedule I'd maintained for 40 years. No alarm clocks, no rush hour traffic, no neighbors whose schedules I needed to consider. Just the gentle progression of light across water, and the patient succession of seasons Caroline had always said was nature's way of teaching us about permanence and change. The veterans had started coming in April, 5 men and 2 women for the first retreat, people carrying wounds both visible and hidden, looking for the kind of peace that only comes from being understood without having to explain yourself. I'd stayed away during their visit, respecting their privacy, but I'd seen them from a distance walking the shoreline, sitting on the dock Caroline and I had built, using the space exactly as she'd envisioned. Dana Rodriguez, the program director, had stopped afterward to thank me personally. "Mr. Dalton, I can't tell you what this place means to them, to us." One of the participants said it was the first time in months he'd slept through the night without nightmares. I'd nodded, thinking about Caroline's voice during her final weeks. "Promise me you will find a way to make something beautiful, continue to grow," she'd whispered one evening, when pain medication made words difficult. I'd thought she meant her garden, but maybe she'd been talking about something larger. The house in town had sold quickly to a young couple with twin daughters who'd been enchanted by Caroline's garden spaces and the tree swing I'd built for Ethan 30 years ago. Watching them walk through the rooms, planning where their furniture would go, their children's artwork would hang, I'd felt something unexpected, joy. Not for my own situation, but for theirs. The house would be full again, would shelter love and laughter and the ordinary magic of family life. Some things ended, so better things could begin. The real estate agent had handed me a check that represented 40 years of mortgage payments, improvements, and the simple appreciation of property in a desirable neighborhood. It was more money than I'd expected, enough to live comfortably at the lake for the rest of my life without worrying about finances. But the money hadn't been the point. Freedom had been the point. I'd heard from Ethan only once since the donation became public. A single text message that had arrived on my phone like a final judgment. "I hope your pride was worth destroying our family." I'd read it twice, then deleted it without replying. Some conversations end, not because you choose to stop talking, but because there's simply nothing left to say. Now, on a warm evening in early June, I sat on the dock with a cup of coffee, watching the sun settle toward the tree line on the far shore. The water was glass still, reflecting the sky so perfectly that it was hard to tell where reality ended and reflection began. Loons called from somewhere across the lake, their voices wild and lonely, but not sad. There was a difference between being alone and being lonely, I'd learned. Loneliness was wanting something you couldn't have. Being alone was accepting what you had and finding it sufficient. The mailbox at the end of the gravel drive held mostly practical correspondence now. Bills, bank statements, communications from the Veterans Organization about their programs. But today had brought something different. A letter addressed in handwriting that looked familiar but had changed over time, grown more careful, more measured. I'd opened it standing by the mailbox, unwilling to carry its weight into the cabin until I knew what it contained. "Dad," it began, "I know it's been months since we spoke, and I know you probably don't want to hear from me, but I needed to write this, needed to try one more time to explain what happened, why things went so wrong between us. Madison and I are getting divorced. It's been coming for a while, but the whole situation with Christmas and the cabin kind of accelerated things. She said I'd become someone she didn't recognize, someone who would treat his own father like an obstacle to be managed rather than a person to be loved. She was right. I've been in therapy, trying to figure out how I became the kind of man who could exclude his father from Christmas dinner and then call the next day asking for favors. The answer isn't pretty, but it's honest. I got scared after Mom died, scared that grief would make you weak, make you dependent, make you someone I'd have to take care of, instead of someone who took care of me. So I started pulling away before you could become a burden. Except you never became a burden. You just became alone. I know the cabin donation hurt. I know you probably did it partly to teach me a lesson about taking things for granted. But I've been reading about the Veterans Program, and I think Mom would have loved what you did. She always said the best memorial to someone was continuing their work, not preserving their stuff. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I'm not asking for anything. I just wanted you to know that I understand now what I threw away, and I'm sorry. Not sorry I got caught. Not sorry things didn't work out the way I planned, but truly sorry I forgot how to be your son. If you ever want to talk, you know my number. If you don't, I understand that too. Your son, if you'll still have me, Ethan. I'd read the letter 3 times before folding it and walking back to the cabin. It sat now on the kitchen table, beside my coffee cup, and the evening light that slanted through windows Caroline had chosen for their perfect view of the water. The letter changed nothing fundamental. Apologies, however heartfelt, couldn't undo months of manipulation and exclusion. They couldn't restore trust that had been systematically demolished, or repair the relationship that had been sacrificed to convenience and financial pressure. But they could acknowledge truth. And truth, even painful truth, was something I could respect. I thought about the boy Ethan had been, curious, generous, eager to help with whatever project I was working on in the garage. I thought about the young man who had called every Sunday during his first years of marriage, who'd brought Madison to family dinners and tried to build bridges between her family and ours. That person had existed. The question was whether he still did, underneath the layers of fear and selfishness that had accumulated over time. Maybe the divorce would help him find out. Maybe losing everything he'd thought he wanted would remind him of what actually mattered. Or maybe it wouldn't, and he'd blame me for his marriage failing the same way he'd blame me for being an inconvenience to his Christmas plans. Either way, it was no longer my responsibility to manage his emotions or enable his choices. A loon called across the water, its voice carrying clearly in the evening air. Caroline had loved that sound, had said it reminded her that some things remained wild and free, no matter how much the world tried to domesticate them. I finished my coffee and made my way inside, where the cabin's familiar sounds welcomed me home. The settling of timber, the whisper of wind through screens, the steady tick of the grandfather clock, marking time in a place that was finally, completely mine. On the kitchen counter, a folder held correspondence from the Veterans Organization, letters from participants thanking me for the retreat space, photos from recent gatherings showing people who looked relaxed in ways that only came from being understood. Caroline's vision made manifest, serving people who had earned the right to peace through service and sacrifice. Tomorrow would bring its own small tasks, maintenance around the property, a trip to town for groceries, maybe a call to Tom Henderson to see how the new family was settling into our old house. The quiet work of a life lived on purpose rather than by default. But tonight, I sat in Caroline's chair and looked out over water that reflected the last light of day like polished pewter. The letter from Ethan lay folded on the table beside me, not thrown away, but not answered either. Some communications deserve time to settle before you knew what they were worth. 3 years ago, I'd thought losing Caroline was the worst thing that could happen to me. It had taken until now to understand that losing myself, becoming the diminished, accommodating shadow of the man she'd married, would have been worse. I'd rebuilt instead. Not the life we'd planned together, but one that honored the foundation we'd laid. The cabin where she had dreamed of reading books by the water, The garden of relationships that required tending and pruning, and the wisdom to know which plants deserved continued care. The grandfather clock chimed 10 times, its voice echoing through rooms that held 40 years of marriage, 3 years of mourning, and now the beginning of something that felt like redemption. Outside, night settled over Clearwater Lake with the gentle finality of a well-told story. Stars emerged one by one, reflected in water so still it seemed solid enough to walk on. Somewhere in the darkness, fish moved through depths that had never known the sound of angry voices or disappointed expectations. I turned off the lights and made my way to the bedroom, carrying with me the satisfaction of a day lived on my own terms and the anticipation of whatever tomorrow might bring. The bed was comfortable, the sheets smelled like the cedar sachets Caroline had made years ago, and the sound of water lapping against the dock served as nature's lullaby. For the first time in 3 years, I fell asleep not wondering what I'd lost, but grateful for what I'd found: the courage to choose dignity over family harmony, solitude over manipulation, and the quiet strength that comes from building something that belongs entirely to you. Some stories end with reconciliation, with families learning to love each other better. This one ended with something rarer and perhaps more valuable: a man learning to love himself enough to demand the respect he deserved. The lake held its secrets in patient silence, reflecting stars that had watched human dramas play out for millennia with the detachment of eternal perspective. By morning, the water would reflect sunlight instead, beginning another day in a place where peace was possible because it had been chosen rather than hoped for.